All right, doing a presentation on the cerebellum in speech. During this presentation, we'll discuss the general structure and function of the cerebellum. This will lead us to how the cerebellum is reciprocally connected to higher order brain regions throughout the neocortex. Specifically, we will focus on the cerebellum's role in speech production and the extent to which the cerebellum is responsible for non-motor aspects of speech processing. The anatomy and basic layout of the cerebellum can be seen as being divided into three structures: the anterior lobe in blue, the posterior lobe in yellow, and follicular nodular lobe in red. And as you can see, the thick yellow lines on the top are the primary fissure, and the sulcus horizontalis underneath that. And from a different view, we can see a sagittal slice, and we can better see the relative sizes of each lobe, with the anterior lobe now in purple. Functionally, the anterior lobe is responsible for maintaining muscle tone, which means it keeps the muscles passively contracted. The posterior lobe coordinates fine motor movement and movement accuracy, and the follicular nodular lobe is involved in balance through tracking the position of different parts of the body. The cerebellum communicates with the rest of the cerebrum through three large peduncles, the inferior in green, the inferior in green, superior in blue, and middle cerebellar peduncle in orange. Much like the neocortex, the cerebellum is comprised mainly of highly folded cerebellar cortex, which receives afferent projections from other areas and sends out efferent projections, which make up the white matter called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. This image does a nice job of showing just how dense the cortical folding is. From this, you can see why the cerebellum, while being much smaller than the neocortex, contains 80% of the surface area of the neocortex. You can see the gray matter, which is just on the other side of the pia matter marked in green, and the white matter is what can be outlined as the tree, or the arbor vitae. Besides the cerebellar cortex, gray matter regions also exist in the more interior regions, like the dentate nucleus in green, which is involved in coordination of the upper and lower limbs. And we have the globus and emboliform nuclei in blue, involved in movements of the trunk, and the vestigial nucleus, which is involved in balance. So looking at a slice of the cerebellar cortex, we see that when information is sent to the cerebellum, it takes an indirect path to reach extensively branched cells called Purkinje cells. And these cells interact with other cell types to create a circuit that is repeated in parallel, like the pages of the book. And so it's a simple circuit that is basically can comprise the entire cerebellar cortex, and these Purkinje cells then project to the deeper cerebellar nuclei, which we will discuss. And from the nuclei, which we've discussed, the interior nuclei of the cerebellum, and from those nuclei, information is then sent to various areas in the brain stem, like the thalamus, which can then influence neocortical regions or descending motor tracts to modify movement. So here you can see that the Purkinje cells create what's called a Purkinje cell layer, and those the dendrites that are getting information from other parts of the brain create the molecular layer on top, and they're processing information. And when that information is going out, it all is combined into a white matter tract, which leaves the cerebellum through those peduncles that we talked about. And so what the cerebellum does is it coordinates sensory motor movement. Primarily, it is responsible for the smoothness and the accuracy of movement. And you can think of learning how to ride a bike. The cerebellum is going to be an indispensable part of being able to do that because it is responsible for unconscious motor adaptation via a process called prediction error based learning. And what prediction error based learning is comprised of is a motor command that's sent to the cerebellum and the body at the same time. And while the body is acting out the motor command sent from the motor regions of the neocortex, the cerebellum is creating what's called an efferent copy, which is a internal copy of that movement, and it's processing that movement in order to create a predicted sensory outcome. And once the cerebellum has a predicted sensory outcome, it then compares what it predicted from what the cerebellum is now getting as sensory feedback as the movement is being done in real time. And so it's creating a comparison between what it expects and what is actually happening. And once there is a mismatch, or if there is a mismatch, then that information is sent back to the neocortex for further motor adjustments. And if there is no discrepancy, it's basically the neocortex will just keep going on and keep producing movement. And so in another flow chart, we can just see simply that the cerebellum uses a prediction. It receives input. If the input doesn't match the prediction, there's an error, and it's a feedback loop where the error influences a updated prediction. And just to explain this using a diagram of the afferent efferent projections into and out of the cerebellum, we can see that the motor commands coming from the neocortex with the red line, and using the blue line, you can see that the projection from the neocortex splits, projecting into the pons and then into the cerebellum, and at the same time, the bifurcation right above the pons leads the afferent connection into the body, so that when a motor command comes down the tract, it gets split at the same time, goes into the body, goes into the cerebellum, and once the cerebellum has that information, it's producing that prediction that we spoke about, and at that time, it's getting the information from the green afferent or efferent projection from the body, and then it's doing a comparison and sending any relevant information back to the neocortex. And this diagram is just showing you that, like the motor example we just spoke of, the cerebellum is not only connected to the motor regions of the brain, it's actually connected to a very diverse network that spans almost the entire cerebral cortex, and it's highly connected to regions involving language processing, which is what we'll be getting into next. And to discuss that, we're going to discuss what happens to linguistic processing after there's been damage or non-invasive cerebellar stimulation. And common side effects of either of these things are problems or deficits in linguistic prediction, word generation, and verbal working memory. Another example, just showing the involvement of the cerebellum in linguistic processing, is the cross-lateralization associated with the left side of the brain. So likewise, how the left side of the brain is highly involved in speech processing and speech production, the right side of the cerebellum has also been shown in fMRI studies to be highly activated by linguistic processing. And so getting back to tying this all together, so we know that the cerebellum uses prediction error to produce motor adaptation over time. And likewise, we have seen that the cerebellum is involved in linguistic prediction, word generation, and verbal working memory. So what does it mean for the brain to do linguistic prediction? So it's just a couple of steps, but they seem basic, but they're actually pretty complicated. And so the steps in understanding speech is to register ambiguous stimulus, and this would be exemplified by what are called phonemes, which are single distinct sounds that make up words. Like, for example, these could be the sound D, G, or B, and the brain combines phonemes into words and then transforms words into meaning. And so the brain, and what is likely to be one of the mechanisms for producing this hierarchy of meaning is the same predictive processing like the brain does with movement. Oh my God, it took way too long.